My name is Pastor Stephen Conway, and we're glad that you've joined us today. If you're like me, then your heart and your minds have been stirred over the past few weeks with everything that's been taking place in our nation. And we've been praying, as we hope that you have been too. We believe that God is still in control, no matter how out of control things seem. So we've added a special feature. After our sermon today, we want you to stay with us, and you'll see a special interview that was conducted a little while ago at Detroit Northwest. We believe it'll be a blessing, and we hope and pray that it will help to foster conversation so that as ministers of reconciliation, God can use each and every one of us to bring about a state of affairs.
المحبة تفرق في الحق.
ভালোবাসা সর্বদা রক্ষা করে।
Amour sempre confirme.
Liebe sucht nicht seinen eigenen Vorteil.
Amour toujours persévérer.
Since God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. To love every person, every nationality, every background, every history, every soul. Because in life we find faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love.
Greetings, Michigan Conference family. With the recent and unnecessary tragic loss of life, my heart continues to go out in sympathy to the families of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd, and to all who have suffered. I wish to express my sorrow, and I pray for God's close presence and peace to be with each one. As a pastor, there have been moments when the turn of events is so grievous that I can't find the words to express what I want to say. I simply stand by those who grieve and pray in my heart that God will make up the difference of my human limitations. This is one of those moments. In the story of the Good Samaritan, Christ portrays the nature of true religion. He demonstrates that it's not possible to love God without genuine love for our neighbor. He also forever settles the question of who is my neighbor. My neighbor is not merely someone of the church or faith to which I belong. It has no reference to race or color or class distinction. Our neighbor is every person who needs our help, every soul who is wounded and bruised by the adversary. This lesson from the very lips of Jesus is so important for us today. Selfishness is the root of racism, discrimination, and any other crime against a human brother or sister. It extinguishes the fire of love and dispels the graces that make character beautiful. Its results are manifested in the abuse of power, the mistreatment of others, and self-justification. Our response to the moments in which we live either defy or affirm our profession of Christian discipleship. Let me share this divine principle. The way to dispel darkness is to admit light. The best way to deal with error is to present truth. It is only the revelation of God's love that makes manifest the deformity and sin of the heart-centered self. You see, to be a good Samaritan requires the realization that it is you and I that are in heaven's plan to relieve oppression, suffering, and distress. This is love. And the truth is that it's been absent in many of our homes, in society, and sadly, even in many of our churches. Some of us may wonder how we can represent Christ in this context. The golden rule is the principle of genuine courtesy with its truest illustration seen in the life of Christ. In associating with others, we should aim to put ourselves in their place. We should enter into their feelings and their difficulties and disappointments, their joys and their sorrows. We should identify with them. Then we should do to them as we would have them do to us if the roles were reversed. Let's be intentional and proactive to minister as Jesus did to those in affliction or sin. And when we see human beings in distress, suffering, or despair, we will never say, "This does not concern me." The Bible says it this way in Micah 6:8. "He has shown you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly."
Hi everyone, it's Aunt Fernita. Today's story is called, What Is It? The memory verse is from Isaiah chapter 58, verses 13 and 14. If you call the Sabbath a delight, you will find your joy in the Lord. Today's message is we worship God when we enjoy keeping the Sabbath. Do you know what a desert is like? It is hot during the day and cold at night, with all the sand and little or nothing growing. Where could you find food in a desert? The Israelites traveled in the desert and they were almost out of food. What do you think they did? God took such good care of the Israelites. He sent a cloud to shade them from the hot desert sun in the day. He sent a pillar of fire at night to light their camp. He had freed them from Egypt and destroyed their enemies in the Red Sea. But the Israelites were beginning to worry. It had been 6 weeks since God had led them out of Egypt, and the food they had brought with them was almost gone. "Back in Egypt, we had all the food we could eat," they grumbled. "But here in this desert, we're going to starve to death." They complained bitterly to Moses. Of course, God had no intention of letting them starve to death. "I will rain down bread from heaven," God told Moses. "It will be there in the morning. The people are to go out every day and gather an omer each, but they must not keep any of it until the next day. I am going to test them to see if they follow my instructions." Sure enough, the next morning the ground was covered with thin white flakes. The people were surprised. "What is it?" they asked, again and again. It looked like frozen dew all over the ground. "This is the bread God promised you. Gather it and eat it today, but don't try to keep any for tomorrow. It won't be good." So the people called it manna, which means, "What is it?" They gathered it up and tasted it. It tasted sweet like honey, and there was enough for everyone. But as soon as the sun grew hot, the manna that remained on the ground melted away. Some people gathered a lot. Some people gathered a little. All the people had just what they needed regardless of how much they gathered. "Don't keep any of it until the next morning," God had said. But some of them paid no attention. The next morning their leftover manna was full of worms and smelled bad. On the 6th day, the instruction was different. "Today you're going to gather twice as much," Moses said. "Tomorrow is God's Sabbath, a day of rest. There won't be any manna on the ground in the morning. So get enough for today and bake it or boil it, but save some of it for tomorrow." The double portion they were told to gather to keep for Sabbath would not get wormy. But wouldn't you know, some people didn't gather twice as much that Friday? Instead, they got up on Sabbath morning expecting to find manna. They had to learn their lesson the hard, hungry way. Of course, there was no manna on the ground that Sabbath morning, and there was none on any Sabbath that came after. How long will they refuse to follow my instructions? God sighed to Moses. The story of the manna teaches us two things. First, just like the Israelites, we honor God when we obey Him. Following His directions is an act of worship. It also teaches us that God knows best. His plans for us are for our own good. Following His instructions is the only way to really be happy. It took the Israelites a while to learn that they needed to follow God's instructions about the manna. They finally got it right. And it's a good thing, because that's what God fed them for the 40 years they spent in the wilderness. They also learned how important the Sabbath is to God. He wanted them and us to make it a special day, different from other days. When they kept the Sabbath special, when they didn't work by gathering manna, they were showing God their love and obedience, and they were really worshiping Him.
Created and produced by Falvo Fowler. This podcast is read by Franita Buddy Fullwood for Gracelink.net. Animation and artwork by Giogo Godoy. Audio is post-produced by Faith To at Studio El Piso in Singapore. The theme music is by Clayton Kinney. The audio engineer was Maurice Bailey.
Good morning and happy Sabbath to you all. Glad that you could join us for worship. Let us go ahead and pray together. Loving Father and our God, we're thankful for life and health and a portion of strength. We ask that your Spirit might be here with us and open our hearts and our minds as we spend time looking into the Scriptures. Challenge us, Father, is what we ask. In the worthy name of Jesus, amen. Our scripture passage today comes from the book of Luke, chapter 18. Luke chapter 18, verse 1, the Bible says, "Then he spoke a parable to them, that men always ought to pray and not lose heart, saying, There was in a certain city a judge, who did not fear God nor regard man. Now there was a widow in that city, and she came to him, saying, Get justice for me from my adversary. And he would not for a while. But afterward he said within himself, Though I do not fear God nor regard man, yet because this widow troubles me, I will avenge her, lest by her continual coming she weary me. Then the Lord said, Hear what the unjust judge said. And shall not God avenge his own elect, who cry out day and night to him, though he bears long with them? I tell you that he will avenge them speedily." This is a fascinating parable that Jesus shares, and as the Lord and I were wrestling with this thing, I believe he brought out some things that will both challenge and encourage us today. The parable only has several characters, and the first character is the judge. Now in Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 18, this is the New Living Translation, concerning judges, Scripture says, "Appoint judges and officials for yourselves from each of your tribes in all the towns the Lord your God is giving you. They must judge the people fairly." In Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 1, in the King James Version, it reads, "If there be a controversy between men, and they come unto judgment, that the judges may judge them, then they shall justify the righteous and condemn the wicked." Now, Jesus' hearers would have understood all of these passages that we just read, and because of this background, his listeners would immediately recognize in his description of this judge that he was not in fact fit to be a judge. Now, despite what the listeners thought of the judge, it's reasonable, if not logical, to believe that he would and should be involved in settling disputed matters. That's just how it was in their country at this time. But Jesus is getting ready to blow the minds of his listeners when he introduces the next character in this parable. And his next character is a widow. Now let's get a little bit of background. In the first century, women were not allowed in court, and thus their testimony was considered inadmissible. Now, beloved, the fact that this woman shows up informs us of the desperate nature of her situation. Her husband is dead. In addition to this, she has no son, no brother, no uncle, no father to plead her case. For if she had, this is speaking about her right to property, that her right be vindicated against the objection of this adversary. Now, friends, Jesus doesn't give details about the dispute between the widow and the adversary. Rather, he comes back to the judge at this point in the parable. And the judge affirms his seemingly unshakable position of indifference. Mark that word, dear friends, indifference. Indifference is defined as a lack of interest, concern, or sympathy. Quite frankly, this judge didn't care. The judge now goes on thinking to himself that though he is indifferent, this woman has wearied me with her persistent demands for justice, and therefore the judge relents and says, "I will rule in her favor." Beloved, at this point, Jesus appeals to his listeners to hear what the unjust judge says. "I'm indifferent. I'm unrighteous, but I will vindicate or defend this widow's right." There's a very important principle here. The unrighteous, my dear friends, can do the right thing for the wrong reasons. Our question is, if we consider ourselves to be righteous, can we as righteous men and women do the right thing for the right reasons? But at this point, Jesus pivots, and he does something that is unique and unusual. For Jesus doesn't always give the point of the parable. Most often the point is so obvious and self-evident that he doesn't need to, but here he inserts the meaning. Listen, "And shall not God avenge his own elect, which cry day and night unto him, though he bear long with them?" Now we need to press pause here, my dear friends, because we need to rehearse what we just heard. There is a high probability that when we first went over the parable, that the point of the parable was in fact missed. And if we miss that, then we cannot understand Jesus' explanation. A woman is being denied what is legally hers. This woman then violates cultural and civic law in order to attain what is rightfully hers. A corrupt judge, not persuaded by her legal right, nor dissuaded by her cultural and legal violations, then grants her justice. Jesus' point, my dear friends, is if an unjust judge can overlook a right claim and overlook cultural and civic violations and yet ultimately grant justice, how much more is God able to grant justice even for those who have sinned against him? Now let's remember, my dear friends, why Luke told us that Jesus was sharing this parable in the first place. You remember? That men and women ought always to pray and faint not. Now this was amazing to me because Jesus in this parable strikes at two reasons why his followers faint or give up in the process of praying. The first one we all know, and that is we don't receive what we ask for when we ask for it. And so we simply stop asking. But number two is important. We tend, that is you and I, so often to look at our personal sins and failures. And when we do this, we are convinced that God won't hear our prayers. This parable, my dear friends, suggests otherwise. Some seem to feel that they must be on probation and must prove to the Lord that they are reformed before they can claim his blessings. But these dear souls may claim the blessing even now. They must have his grace. Let me rephrase that. We must have his grace, the Spirit of Christ, to help our infirmities, or we cannot form a Christian character. Jesus loves to have us come to him just as we are, sinful. Anybody sinful today? Helpless. Anybody feel helpless today? Dependent. Friends, I think this is so very important in terms of what we learn from this parable, especially this last part, because I've heard during everything that's been going on, well, you know, I'm all for protesting, but the vandalism and the riots and so forth and so on, and the attitude is as though what happens in terms of vandalism and so forth and so on, it completely and totally, it does away with or dismisses the reality that judgment or justice was denied. And I believe that this parable that Jesus shares here in the 18th chapter of Luke, it challenges that notion. Because what Jesus is saying is that even if an individual is unrighteous or unjust, that does not mean that God closes his ears to the cries of that individual. Let's consider this woman in the parable. Did she have a right to be there at the court of her day, at the city gate? No, she did not. Not culturally and not civically. She was in violation, and yet this unjust judge heard her cry. And that last part of the verse that we read there in Luke chapter 18, though he bear long with them, in the original language, it means though he has mercy on them. In other words, the one who is in need of justice is also in need of God's mercy. Did you see what Jesus just did there? In the parable, I encourage you to pray. I want to encourage you to do what, beloved? I want to encourage you to pray, and I want you to pray persistently. Prayer is not our last resort. It is perhaps our most powerful weapon. So I encourage you, my dear friends, to pray and continue to pray and do it persistently, for we cannot weary God. And I want to encourage you to do more than just pray in the light of the times in which we live. Beloved, I believe in prayer as we've just demonstrated, I hope and I believe. And Jesus taught very important lessons about prayer. But I think when people are experiencing challenging and difficult times, it can come across as dismissive. pie in the sky for us to say, oh, just keep on praying and, just we can't do anything but pray. I want to encourage you to do something more than pray in the light of the times in which we live. And doing more than that doesn't mean we don't believe our prayers will be effective. The life, one of my favorite authors puts it, the life must be like Christ's life, between the mountain and the multitude. And here's the point I want to make. He who does nothing but pray will soon cease to pray, or his prayers will become a formal routine. Beloved, I want to encourage you to put action to your prayers. Yes, believe and pray as if everything depends on God, but then move and work as if everything depends on you. Number 2, if you're frustrated and angry, write your senator, your state senators, your federals, the ones that serve in the federal government in Washington, D.C. Write your representatives. I hope you know who these people are. And by all means, my dear friends, vote. Now, I know that some are wary of voting due to the fear that God will hold you responsible for what the individuals in office do. But I want you to think with me, my dear friends, today. And I want to challenge you on this. Brothers and sisters, do you believe that God will not equally hold us accountable if by our inaction and our neglect, if injustice prevails? I will say to you, if I was speaking in King James English, he will certainly hold us accountable. He will certainly hold us responsible. So I want you to pray, my dear friends. Pray as though everything depends on God, and then do something. Write, call, so that by God's grace, as Christians, we can make a mark in this world in which we live. Beloved, I know that this is not our final home. I know the earth as it is going to be destroyed. But if God so loved the world that he sent his son to die for every human being who is a citizen of this planet and of the human race, then if we love God, then we should be moved to act on behalf of every human being, every citizen of the human race. Won't you pray with me today? Loving Father and our God, thank you for the precious reminder of Jesus. The reminder that while we are waiting on justice and righteousness to prevail in the world in which we live, so too you are waiting on justice and righteousness to prevail in our hearts and in our lives. Lord, we have offended you, and yet in your grace and your mercy and your long-suffering nature, you have waited patiently for us. So, Father, help us to learn to wait patiently for you. We know that you will move and you will act, and you do hear the cries of the oppressed. And Father, even our unChristlikeness does not dismiss the suffering, the oppression, and the injustice that your people experience. Lord, we long for your return. If anything, what we are witnessing take place in our nation is just one more evidence that we look for a city that has foundations whose builder and maker is God. No matter how much we appreciate the privileges of living in this country, we are looking for a better country, because none of us will ever receive the treatment that you have created us to treat as long as we are under the rulership of any of the governments of this world. Father, have mercy on your people. Have mercy. And I pray that you would use something that was meant for evil to bring about something which is overwhelmingly good. Lord, I've seen you moving in the hearts, not only of my African American brothers and sisters, my brothers and sisters of color, but I've seen you moving in the hearts and minds of my white brothers and sisters as well, with an outpouring, an overwhelming outpouring of love and support and encouragement, the likes of which I have never seen in my lifetime. And it must be because of the moving of your Spirit. But Father, that's not enough. Continue to move in us and through us until we are so emptied of self that your Spirit in latter rain power can be poured out into our hearts and into our lives. And the last events in this earth can be rapid ones, and we can see Jesus return in our lifetime. That's our prayer. But it's only if you do what you're able to do. And in humble cooperation, we do what you've asked us to do. Please answer this prayer in the worthy and precious name of Jesus. Amen. Amen. God bless you, brothers and sisters. Please enjoy the rest of your Sabbath. And I want to encourage you to stick around because we have a video interview that talks a little bit about race and racism. It's an interview that I conducted with Dr. Clarence Hollinsett, and I think it'll be very, very informative. I want to give thanks to Brother Mike Randall for helping us to set that up. This is only part one that you'll see today, but again, I want to encourage you to stay by and enjoy. God bless. Hello. We are here today having a discussion with Dr. Clarence Hollinsett, adjunct professor in the sociology department at Andrews University. And he has written a fascinating thesis on segregation and race relations in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we wanted to have a bit of a discussion where we not only talk about your thesis, but also talk about some contemporary issues and how your thesis interacts with contemporary issues of the day. So I guess we'll start off with saying welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
For being here today, Dr. Hollinsett. And I want to ask you to share for our listeners and viewers, what area was your doctoral research in?
Yeah, well, thank you, Pastor Conway, for having me and this discussion, which is a very important one to have. And I'm glad that we could get this going. As I told Pastor Conway, I don't want to keep all this information to myself, so I'm glad we're getting it out there. So thanks for the invitation. My doctoral thesis is, and I just want to say before we get into all this, it was really God's power and His grace leading all the way, even through the research and directing, because at one point it could get a little overpowering, and so I just want to give God the glory for all of this. Mm-hmm. And so my doctoral dissertation was in the area of sociology and in the subunit or subsection, sociology of religion. And in there, my interest was looking at segregation in the church. And then, of course, since I have an Adventist background, I was particularly interested in segregation in the Seventh-day Adventist Church in North America.
Is there such a thing?
Oh, yes.
Oh, wow. Okay, okay.
Yeah, there is, and it's not something that's spoken of so much, so some members may not even necessarily be aware, mm-hmm. but it is officially segregated. Mm-hmm. And not the entire, just to be clear, not the entire structure. And just to sort of make that point clear, you have 5 general levels in the church structure: the local church, next the local conference, above that the union level, above that the division, and then finally a general conference. So the segregation is only at the bottom 2 levels of the structure, that is the local church and the local conference.
Wow, interesting. Now, another question to follow up. What is it that interested you in this particular subject matter?
It interested me because it's something, some things bother you. And sometimes things don't seem right. And in this particular instance, it's like someone has to say something. I'm one of those that are never satisfied with the status quo.
Mm-hmm.
So if no one says it, everyone could just pretend it's okay. And that's not, in my experience, that's not where God leads me. He leads me, he gives me the knowledge and the, direction, and I sit and, for me, what is the point in being silent? What do I gain from it?
So don't ignore the elephant in the room. Let's address it. Let's talk about it. Let's
That's exactly right.
since we're here and I'm so glad that you did follow through and do the research and the study and whatnot that's reflected in your dissertation. But I want to start with defining terms, because whenever we're having conversations like these, it is easy for one person to use a term and the other person to interpret it based on the way they define the term. And so you really can't have a coherent discussion because people's definitions aren't agreed upon. And so I want to start with what is probably, for most of us, a basic definition. And it's, I want you to define, Dr. Holland said, race.
Now, that's a very good question, because race, when we speak of race, first of all, in literature and in academia, race is regarded as a social construct. Now,
a social construct. What do you
Yes.
mean when you say it's a social
Exactly,
construct?
and I was about to stop myself real quick, because anytime I say that, we have to clarify what does that mean. So social construct essentially says this is the way it's imagined in the minds of society, and it's coming out of a particular experience as well. So for example, if you look at on the global scale, when you look at the world, the race is used more or less in what we call the Western world. You go to other parts of the world and they might ask you, what are you talking about? So it comes out of that societal construct based on a particular experience. In the American context in particular, which we're speaking about, it came up, and in the Western world in general, with Europe and America, it came up in the era of colonization in particular. So as a matter of fact, what we label as race, it's only around 500 years old. So you go back to around roughly late 1400s, with the time European explorers really started going out into what we call the New World and so forth. And the idea was we meet other people who look different from us. So that's where guys like Charles Darwin come in, and classification, and Carolus Linnaeus, and they came up with what they call taxonomy, which means you label things in society and you group them. And humans, they threw humans in that whole mix to where we must categorize humans. I mean, it got so bad to a point where you have two general views. So some people have the view of that humans actually came from different lineages, or they're different types of humans. And that's what you call polygenesis. So in other words, there was more than one beginning. And there's the other view, which is monogenesis, says all humans came from the very same two parents. So some are even trying to prove that not all humans are the same. They came from different lineages. So that's part and parcel of understanding the broader subject.
Quick insertion there. Christians would come from which one of those trees of thought, or would
monogenesis.
Okay.
So when you break down the word, mono meaning one, genesis meaning beginning, poly meaning many. So you either have many beginnings or one beginning. So
Okay.
generally speaking, in religion and Christianity, you look at monogenesis. We came from the very same two parents. But just emphasizing the point that not all people necessarily believe that. There was the view, particularly from the 1600s, around the time Carolus Linnaeus started taxonomizing humans. Some people believe that there are different lineages, so different points of beginning, so which means not all humans, or what we call humans, and people use various labels like Homo sapiens and so forth, are necessarily the same. And they even went as far as going into craniology, studying the size of the skull to show you that you're not all equal. But anyway, I use that to look at the broader picture and the time frame we're dealing with for when race came in, which was really your question. how the word race and how I define it. So that's why I was giving that background. So race was really used in that era of colonization, going off, as I said, guys like Charles Darwin went, and the idea was, you look different from us. You can't be like us. Not only that, there was actually something around that time called the English race. So as far as the English were concerned, they were superior. And you meet other people in other lands, South America and so forth, you cannot be on our own level. And so this is where classification came in. And you throw America into the mix, early 1600s, Africans came in, 1619. In fact, last year, now, 2019, you had what they call the year of return in like Ghana and so forth. People were celebrating 400 years from the time Africans came over. But anyway, that's a sort of a side note. But it still falls within that time frame of the American story. So from the early 1600s, go on in the American story. Race, it was sort of there, but not as big yet, because Africans who came to America did not come as slaves as first. So they came as more like indentured servants, same as whites, like from the Irish and so forth, who came off, worked 7 years to gain their freedom. And so as we went later on, as we progressed in the 17th century, later 1600s, with Bacon's Rebellion in the 1670s and so forth, and the idea of labor came in, and who are we going to find to work our land? So before it was Africans, it was the Native Americans going to work the land. Then at one point, the Irish would do the work. No one else would do it. So the English even turned their noses down on the Irish. So you have all that sort of mixed history going on. But nonetheless, Africans brought over ended up doing the labor at free labor it was. So they were like indebted for life. And so that's what I'm looking at is the evolution of our race came into play in America. And so now you're not worth as much, and you could work for me for free. And so then skin color started to play a bigger role in that regard. And so to give a definition of race, that's why we say it's a social construct, because it was constructed with the socio-historical experience.
Yeah, so what I hear you saying is that race then, prior to a certain time, it wasn't used the way that we use it in the 21st century.
Definitely not.
But it has evolved in its use, but at the root of it has been the exploitation of others by whoever happened to be in power at a particular point in time.
That's correct. So as I go back to taxonomy and Carolus Linnaeus, that's an important name to remember. Carolus Linnaeus, European, where he classified humans. And so now the idea was, as you get into particularly living the 1600s and into the 1700s, and of course later on with the Enlightenment and so forth, but particularly the 1700s in Europe, they were looking down on Africans and looking at even, the shape of the lips, whatever it was, but they were looked down upon. And
Absolutely. Particularly
particularly as labor and economics came to play a role, and now they were working as for free and forced labor and so forth. But so that's why, and so people today still try to define the word race, and I've looked at it in a dictionary, and all I could do is shake my head, because you look at it and it's speaking of in terms like a group living together, maybe apart from others. All how I look at the definitions, none of it makes sense to me. Now, I know this, but academia also know this, and they're telling you this. They're explaining it to you. As a matter of fact, what we call the the American Anthropological Association, this is another AAA, because I have a background in anthropology as well. They now have, and it's good we're speaking on that issue, they now have what you call a race exhibit going around America, so from city to city. And I had the opportunity to visit that exhibit in Flint not so long ago. What they're doing now, this is academia, and in anthropology in particular, because anthropology deals with issues like evolution and race. And on the race side, anthropology is saying, look, we need to be open and honest about this thing, what race is not. And so now they're being more open, and there's even a traveling exhibit that they put on from city to city, trying to explain to people exactly what I'm saying now.
Absolutely.
And so forth. So I'm glad academia is doing it, but it's not trumpeted loud enough, because people have, never heard of some of those things. But it's being done.
Now, let me a follow-up question about if race is a social construct. if it doesn't exist, at least in the way that the majority of us would think that it exists, and the majority of us would use the term race, if it doesn't exist, then what about racism? What's the connection between race as a social construct and racism?
Now, here's where I spoke of backing up a little bit, and I'm glad you came back to that, because saying that race is a social construct, the follow-up question, or sort of a rhetorical question, then becomes, so what? So what do you mean? Do you mean everything that happened in American history, all the discrimination and the prejudice and everything, we just take it, we forget it as if it never existed? That's where clarification and understanding comes in. So, for example, if we take lynching, can we say, well, lynching wasn't real because race was a social construct? No. So this is where we have to sort of be clear. So now we have to actually deal with the consequences of the construct. And so that's where the distinction comes in and what it has caused. And it's interesting that even on a subject like lynching, even with the American government, there was trouble passing an anti-lynching law, I think up to last year. And recently I inquired about it and looked like an anti-lynching law. We think that this is, antiquated or dated and something that's of the past. But that came all up into the 20th century, lynching and so forth. And so it looks like finally something was passed. And so you could tell of the tension in society and at the legal level, what do we pass a law? But anyway, so do we deal with the consequences? Yes, we have to look at the consequences. And that's where racism comes in, like you're asking. So racism has to deal with the idea that one quote-unquote race is acting superior, not just acting superior to another quote-unquote race, but using that sort of leverage in society. And so it intersects politics, what we call socioeconomic status, your standing in society and your status, and privilege. And we use quote-unquote words like white privilege. Now, of course, I don't necessarily like those terms, but you see those terms used to understand, sociologists or social scientists use those to explain what's happening in society. And so just for clarification, some of those terms I use, like white, black, and so forth, those are not terms I believe I should be using, but this is the sort of to just clarify.
It's where we are.
To explain.
It's how to meet people where we are.
History. Not that I necessarily endorse them. Right. So anyway, so racism is that sort of superiority feeling us over them, but it's all based, really, when you dig a little deeper, it's based on skin color, large rate, and this is what we call phenotype in the study. So phenotype, your physiological makeup. The funny thing is, we all have the same color blood, but then when we speak of, what race is, then we look at skin color, which is really melanin. And so you could look at back and forth the benefits or not of melanin, and some want their skin darker and some not. But anyway, that's what it comes down to. But then you talk about privilege based on skin color, and that's where the construct really shines, and you really start to understand what it means. So yes, that's what racism is, all based on that superiority.
So even though race, as we know it, may be a social construct, what I hear you saying again is that it doesn't do away with some of the treatment of individuals based on a false idea or a warped or twisted idea. And so not just to acknowledge that race may be a social construct and we need to perhaps get rid of it, it does not at the same time wash away the history that is connected to the way that people have treated and been treated based on that social construct.
Definitely not.
And I think that's a powerful point, because to acknowledge that an idea is wrong doesn't do away with the actions that were carried out because people embrace, or as you said, the consequences because people embrace those false ideas. So I like the way you separated those two. Yes, race is a social construct, but there are consequences that have affected thousands of lives.
Exactly.
And
coming out of the ideology. Exactly.
Yeah. Now I want to come back, because that's more of a broader social perspective, more to the point of your thesis and your dissertation. I want to come to the church. One of the lines in your dissertation says that there is a justification of segregation for the sake of mission. And the reason I'm asking you this, Dr. Hollinsett, is because I've heard with my own two ears, I've heard that we need to stay focused on mission, and that this is, although no one would deny it's a discussion that needs to take place, discussion about segregation and so forth and so on, many would suggest that this will take us off of our mission. And if it diverts us from our mission, then it can't be from God. So how would you explain this concept of a justification of segregation for the sake of mission?
Well, actually, it more sounds like an oxymoron to me, because when we speak of mission, if you get to the heart, if you want to speak gospel now, because I have a theological background as well, and this is where the Lord has really used that research to tie in the social science with theology and so forth. But if you want to really talk about mission and get to the heart of the gospel, then what you were describing actually is sort of an antithesis when we say let's do it in a segregated fashion and so forth. And really what it comes down to is the mentality actually behind it. So when we speak about segregation, we need to sort of back up a little bit. So in American history, you've had segregation, particularly post-Civil War. So pre-Civil War, there was sort of, blacks and whites sort of together, even in the church. Actually, I take that back. Early 1800s is when the black church, quote unquote, the black church in America really split off. So around 1816 is a strong marker with the AME Church and AME Zion. 1816 is sort of a marker, but so that's leading up to the Civil War, and particularly after the Civil War, that's when you could say segregation now became more and more full-blown, because this is where what we call Jim Crow picks up. Mm-hmm. And Jim Crow has to do with that same idea of being segregated, and then it got into segregated but equal. Now that's backing up a little bit, and now you come to the church. And the church is burgeoning, and the Christian church is growing and flourishing in America, and late 1800s, and come now to the early 1900s. And there is that tension between society and the church. Mm-hmm. And as you go on, African Americans have been more and more independent, coming in the early 1900s. As I say, it began in a big way in the early 1800s, having their own church. And by the way, that was because they were oppressed in what we call the dominant church. So the dominant churches at that time, when, for example, the AME Church broke out, African Methodist Episcopal Church broke out, it was coming, you had the Methodist Church sort of dominating, Methodists, Lutherans, those what they call mainstream denominations. And so they were actually coming out in the AME's case because literally they were oppressed. So one example was, there are two key figures in that regard, guys like Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. Mm-hmm. As the story went, those guys were on their knees praying in the church, and a deacon came and said, it's like they were in a place, I guess it was not designated for blacks, and they told them to get off their knees. So when we say oppression now, we have to define what we mean by oppression. So if that's not being oppressed, you need to stop praying in church because that section is not designated for you. Then you ask, well, what is? But that's that context. And of course, you have social oppression and so forth. So that's where so when we speak of segregation, to the heart of your question, segregation and mission, what's important for us to do is understand the background to the segregation and how it came about. And so to sort of if I were to tell it straight and not sugarcoat it, because I don't think we should, yes. Segregation in the church really came out of white supremacy. And in fact, that's something I write about. And again, it's not things we should be hiding, but we should be open and honest about it. And that's how we could have an honest dialogue. When we say, quote unquote, whites, blacks, let's come together, let's dialogue. That's the only way we could do it, to cut through the thick tension.
Let me interrupt you, because I want to get back to that justification of segregation on the basis of mission. But you mentioned white supremacy, and I've in having some conversations with white brothers, there's an uncomfortableness when you make a statement about whether it's a term you use, and I understand that you said these may not be terms that you yourself would use or adopt. Exactly. But when you talk about white supremacy and white privilege, some of the response that I sense is that there's kind of a whoa, no, that can't exist, because what you're doing when you use those phrases or those terms is you are then saying that the whole white race is now guilty because they have done this, that, and the other. And a lot of people will say, hey, look, man, I grew up poor. I grew up in an abusive home. I don't feel like I was privileged, or I don't feel like I'm better than anyone based on the color of my skin. Mm-hmm. And so just as a caveat, when you talk about white supremacy, how would you, in a very concise way, how would you define that?
White supremacy, again, goes back to sort of the construct of what we call race. And that's why I say those terms are not adequate, white and so forth. So that's why we use it sort of loosely, not really solid. But anyway, it goes back to the whole construct, what we call white. And again, skin color, again, it's not exactly white or exactly black necessarily, but that's exactly why they're constructs. Mm-hmm. Because this is the way society see it. And when we say now the privilege is attached to it, now society has what we call a schema based on skin color. So now you have status, and in America, as you study American history now and American contemporary society, one example of that, or one cue, is when you look at wealth and the distribution of wealth in America. That's where a lot of social scientists speak of white privilege, because the wealth is concentrated in what we call the white, you could call it middle and upper class, but within white society, with a sprinkles here with others of what we call quote-unquote color, people of color. Again, terms I don't like to use, but nonetheless, for discussion's sake. So when we say white privilege, it's simply to explain how that construct works in the American society.
Again,
white supremacy.
I'm sorry, but some people, upon hearing this, will say, but those people are wealthy because they worked. Mm-hmm. They worked, and they had an American dream, and through their own blood, sweat, and tears, they accumulated and amassed wealth. And so are we to say or attribute that amassing or accumulation of wealth purely to the fact that they are of a particular skin color? So some would disagree with that. How would you respond to that?
I'm glad you pushed that, because now we get into the structure. Now, so here are other terms, again, to sort of explain the situation. So there is what you call racism, as we explained, based on the construct and the feeling of supremacy. And of course, that's where white supremacy comes in, as you were speaking of. Okay, we're superior to you. And of course, that goes back to American history, and quote unquote, blacks were the servants and indebted for life. Okay. So now, as we go on in the system, 1800s, post-Civil War and so forth, we say segregated but equal. And where you start seeing, to explain that, and the white privilege and the segregated but equal, we bring those together. And where it starts to become a little bit clearer is when you start looking at neighborhoods, for example, and that's a classic case in point.
Okay.
So you look at neighborhoods, whether it's inner city Detroit or inner city Memphis, any inner city in America you take your pick, LA, from LA to New York, okay? Look at the inner city, and so what social scientists, for example, look at is where people are concentrated by skin color, for example, the inner city predominant African Americans, and what sort of life are they living on, some on welfare, not necessarily all, and so forth and so forth. Now, why do we say, now you made the point that, okay, they may say they work for it, whites say they work for it, so where does the privilege come in? So I'm making that sort of territorial point to now get into the deeper point of the structure, as I mentioned, come back to the structure. So there is what you call individual racism. It could be on an individual basis, how I treat someone else based on how I think I'm superior to you. But then there is also now structural racism. Okay. Now we're getting into white privilege and what that means. So the structural racism says just what it means. In the structure of American society or social structure, there is that sort of spoken or unspoken hierarchy between who really is more intelligent, and something else is playing into that. Other, believe it or not, myths like IQ, which is literally a myth, is actually feeding into that structure as well. So who has a higher IQ, this, that, and the other, that's perhaps another story, but certainly a side note that needs emphasizing. So in the structure, You have at the federal level and the federal government level, to give you an example to sort of make that a little clearer. In the 1930s, all right, we're speaking of American society, American structure, there was what you call sort of a New Deal burgeoning, right, under FDR. So who is going to be part of the New Deal and part of Social Security and those benefits? Okay, that's one area. Housing is another typical area. Who benefits from housing? So let's just touch on those two real quick. So 1930s and so forth, in policies, in government policies, here is how it worked. If you were in around the 1930s in an agricultural position or in a domestic position, you were not entitled to that New Deal or Social Security, as the case were, okay? But guess who were in those positions? It was predominantly African Americans.
So wait a minute. So what you're saying is that if I was a farmer,
exactly,
or if I was doing some sort of domestic work for someone in their home, then policy had essentially, federal government policy had written me out of benefiting from this New Deal.
Whether we like to face the history or not, we're speaking American history. You've got it.
Okay.
So that's what we mean when we say structure. And structural racism, in other words, it's built into the structure. We could argue the foundation as well. Perhaps not so much because, as we say, they didn't start off as Africans, didn't necessarily start off as slaves, but certainly as the foundation, as time moved on, it was certainly built into the bottom levels of the structure and built firmly into the structure. So that's one key example. So they were sort of cut out. That's how you cut them out without saying publicly, African Americans are not entitled, or only whites are entitled to privilege. So hence you bring the two together, white privilege. That's one classic example. Another one is housing, and I'll stop there with that. Housing, when you had subsidies for housing, again in the early days of the 20th century and forward, African Americans were cut out of that. Okay, you were not entitled. So, and we know, as the story goes in America, wealth building is based on owning what? Land and house. As quote unquote, well, myth or not, the American dream story goes, land and house. And that's exactly where African Americans were disenfranchised or sort of pushed back against or sort of blocked, okay? At the federal level, you had that wall from obtaining those privileges. And so that's why today a lot of the wealth is generational. It came down the line from those who own the land and so forth. And even talking about own the land, another classic example that came to mind is sharecropping. And sharecropping even comes into the 20th century now. You would think, again, this is outdated. You may still find some modes of sharecropping still alive today. But what does that mean? That meant that when Africans came out of, or when slavery was abolished around, as we say, abolished around the mid-1860s, now you speak of, well, what are the former slaves going to do? How are they going to earn a living? Well, here comes one quote-unquote brilliant idea, which is really not brilliant, but you're going to sharecrop. Okay, you're going to till my land as a white owner and master, which is essentially another form of slavery. You're going to work for me, okay? And then you have the little portion of the land to work for yourself, okay? But a lot of the majority of the earnings went to where? Of course, the owner, and then, of course, you get some subsistence production, a little bit for yourself. And so you could see, again, slavery just literally morphed. You get another example, you get into the prison system, we leave that aside, but it's simply morphed in there as well. We targeting and so forth and throwing people into jail. There was the peon system. I mean, you could see the evolution as you go on. All you simply look at is American history. But anyway, these are examples, and housing was definitely one where African Americans were cut off. So, and that's coming into the 20th century as we go on. And so you ask, well, when some whites are defensive and say, well, wait a minute, where's the privilege? Well, all of this is built into the structure, even now. And I'll sort of pass it back, leave it there. Even now, when you go for jobs and so forth, guess what? Even by your very name, as social scientists do the study, you may be discriminated against. They may not even see you, but your name on the application looks black. That's enough.
So, and that's very, very thought-provoking information. I want to come back to the previous question that was underlying this, that this same concept of segregation in a church context is being maintained with the focus being on mission. So in other words, we don't want to disturb the mission, and mission is something that is given to us by God. It's something that He expects us to cooperate. We are obliged to do it, and therefore we don't want to be distracted with these side issues. And so I just to throw a little bit of I guess fuel in the fire for you. When I look at Revelation chapter 14 verses 6 through 12, and I look at segregation, I say, wait a minute, how can a church that has a global mission? And I looked and I saw another angel flying in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. That's global. It's a universal message as far as the earth is concerned. How are we to take this message if we're not living it, right? And so I guess coming back to my original question, how is mission used to be able to justify segregation?
Now, with all due respect, I would kind of throw the question back. So here is sort of a rhetorical retort. What really would you mean, or would someone mean by segregation and mission? Because I said earlier, that's an antithesis when you get to the heart of what mission is and the gospel story. So that's why those two, they don't mesh. You have to sort of try to force a justification on it. And of course, that justification comes from the social experience. So as a social experience, there is segregation. And of course, that's why I went back to understanding where segregation came from, where it sort of real burgeoned in the Jim Crow era, post-Civil War, post-slavery, as the story goes, and segregation now. And essentially, it's coming from the ideology of separate but equal. That's where segregation is coming from. The problem with that is there's nothing equal about segregated but equal, and that's why earlier I was touching on, I'm not sure if I finished the point, when you look at society and the school and the inner city, which I touched on, and you start where I wanted to go with that also to sort of make that point a little clearer. When you look at schools, you look at schools in the suburbs, which may be predominantly white, although they're mixed now, and you look at an inner city, which is all black, and then you look at resources, and you look at teachers and so forth, and the amount of money being spent. And you look at busing, and there was even issues over busing, and should we bus African-American children to white neighborhoods? So you've had all those issues. So if you have a problem with busing and so forth, and let's keep cities black and white, essentially you have two Americas growing up. So then you have, it comes down to the amount of resources, for example, and where you pour resources in. And these things are actually, you don't even need to do a study. These things are right before our very eyes.
Everybody knows it.
It's before our very eyes. So again, when you talk segregation and mission, to come back to, again, the heart of your question, let's understand where segregation is coming from. So it's not segregation but equal. As a matter of fact, that's exactly why in 1954, the Supreme Court struck down segregated schools in Brown versus the Board of Education. Because as it was argued before the court, wait a minute, what do you mean by separate or segregated but equal, or separate but equal? And so this is where clauses of the law, like if you go into the Constitution, came in. For example, the 14th Amendment, and you look at the equal protection and so forth. And you look into those and say, what equal protection when there's no equality, right? But at the heart of it, there is no equality. And so that's where those cases such as this, as a matter of fact, Brown versus Board of Education is sort of a watermark, a great, not necessarily a watershed, but a great historical marker in the evolution of the story in America, race, what we call race and segregation. And so even then, society and whites were having a hard time, and there was push back. No, you can't integrate our schools. And if you ever heard of the Little Rock Nine in Arkansas, and those, right, around the 1960s. And so there was great pushback. And so that's why when you say segregation, that's where it's coming from, the background, separate but equal, but we know it's not equal. So now you come to the church and mission. So that's why I sort of retorted rhetorically, where is the mission and the segregation? How does that really mesh?
Yes.
In light of this discussion?
So, and I'm with you 100%. I think I hear you saying that actually mission is compromised when segregation is involved.
More so.
It's impossible to have an uncompromised biblical mandate that one is following through for mission when it is polluted, diluted with something that is from a sinful, fallen world, segregation with all of its false presuppositions and what have you.
That's one. It really comes down to the mindset. Where is, at the end of the day, when we live here, white, black, wherever, we have to ask ourselves about our sincerity, okay? Where is my mind and where is my heart? And particularly when we speak about the church, is God really leading me down that particular path, for example, segregation? Is that really, or am I just resisting and telling him that's where I'm comfortable in a segregated environment? And so I ask that because I have seen justification from the gospel itself, where, for example, where Jesus healed the man, I want to say the demoniac, but healed this man, and then he wanted to follow Jesus, and then as the story goes, it was told to him, go show
home.
yourself to your people. I have heard this used for justification for segregation. Believe it or not, go to your own people. And essentially stay with your own people. Now, of course, that's what we call extrapolating and interpolating. I mean, you're digging in and you literally put in your own interpretation in there.
Eisegesis.
Right? All of that stuff, you're putting it right in there. So that's when any sort of justification for it, that's why I go back to the heart, the mind and the heart. Where is the heart? Is the heart really on God's leading me? Let me surrender? Or is it more, this is really where I am comfortable, and so I prefer it that way? So, for example, some quote-unquote blacks, African Americans, they may have said, well, we didn't want segregation to begin with, and truly that was the case when segregation started in the Adventist Church, 1944. The laity went to the GC president, and they were actually asking for respect, not segregation. But believe it or not, at that point, from the white leadership standpoint of the church, you are not our equals. How could we be together? How could you get equal respect? That was the attitude. And that's where segregation really came in. That's why I'm going back to the mind and the heart. It all depends on where that is.
And I appreciate that. In our next section, in the next section of our discussion, I want to talk more about the heart and what appears to me anyway to be a resistance to really looking into the heart, a resistance to being able to acknowledge the truth of things that have historically taken place, which cannot be denied. And I want to talk about something that you and I have talked about as well in the next section, and that is individual responsibility versus corporate responsibility. And so, again, I want to say thank you for the time, and can't wait till we can finish having this discussion.